When I look back on the early days of my marriage to Caroline, I realize how naive I was. Our life together had been, at least on the surface, everything I'd hoped it would be. We were both young and successful, steadily climbing the career ladder. I was an executive at a marketing firm, where the hours were long, but the payoff was worth it. Caroline, on the other hand, worked in interior design. Her clients adored her eye for detail and her ability to transform dull spaces into something straight out of a magazine spread. We had met at a friend's wedding 5 years ago. It wasn't love at first sight, but there was something about her that drew me in, something I couldn't put my finger on back then. She was vibrant, with a smile that could melt the polar ice caps and a laugh that was infectious. When she looked at me, it felt like she saw the best version of me, the man I aspired to be. It didn't take long for us to become inseparable. Our relationship was, by all accounts, a whirlwind. Within 6 months of dating, we were living together, and a year after that, we were married. The wedding was a grand affair. Caroline insisted on a large ceremony, and I obliged, happy to give her the day of her dreams. Standing at the altar, watching her walk down the aisle in her white dress, her eyes locked on mine, I felt like the luckiest man alive. I was confident that our marriage would be a strong one, filled with love, laughter, and mutual respect. But as the years went by, I started to notice small things, tiny cracks in the facade that I had once thought unbreakable. At first, they were easy to dismiss. A missed call here, a late night at work there. I told myself it was normal, that every relationship goes through its rough patches. We were both busy after all, and sometimes work had to come first. I never considered that there might be more to it. Caroline's behavior gradually began to change. She would spend more and more time at work, often coming home late, with vague explanations about deadlines and demanding clients. She'd laugh it off when I questioned her, brushing it aside as nothing to worry about. I wanted to believe her, so I did. The alternative was too painful to contemplate. One of the first real signs that something was wrong came about 2 years into our marriage. Caroline had just landed a huge contract to redesign a luxury hotel, and she was thrilled. I was proud of her, genuinely excited for her success, but something felt off. She started spending late nights at the office, sometimes not coming home until well after midnight. When I'd ask her about it, she'd wave me off, saying that she was just swamped with work. I tried to be supportive, but there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then there were the phone calls. She'd receive them at odd hours, and whenever I asked who was calling, she'd give me the same response. Just a client. But the way she'd quickly retreat into another room to take the call, the way her voice would drop to a hushed tone, it didn't sit well with me. I began to wonder if maybe I was being paranoid, but the doubt had already taken root, and once it's there, it's hard to get rid of. Despite these nagging suspicions, I never once imagined that Caroline could be unfaithful. I had put her on a pedestal, convinced myself that she was different, that our love was unshakable. I trusted her completely, and that trust blinded me to the reality that was slowly unfolding right in front of me. We had no children, something we had both agreed on early in our marriage. Caroline was too focused on her career to even consider starting a family, and I was okay with that. At least, that's what I told myself. Sometimes, in the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts, I'd wonder if maybe a child would have brought us closer, anchored us in a way that nothing else could. But those were fleeting thoughts, quickly pushed aside. We had each other, and that was supposed to be enough. Looking back now, it's easy to see the signs, to pinpoint the moments when I should have known something was wrong. But at the time, I was in denial, desperately clinging to the belief that everything was fine. I loved Caroline, and I was willing to overlook the little things, to push aside my doubts in favor of maintaining the peace. Of course, peace is a fragile thing, easily shattered by the harsh truths we try to ignore. I just never imagined that my world would come crashing down in such a spectacularly brutal fashion. That my wife, the woman I had given my heart to, would betray me in a way that was so devastating, so public, that there would be no coming back from it. But all of that was still to come. For now, I was still in the dark, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to tear my life apart. As the months wore on, my unease grew. Caroline was more distant than ever, and the connection we once shared seemed to be slipping away. Our conversations, once filled with warmth and laughter, had become brief and strained, reduced to discussions about work or what to have for dinner. There were no more long talks late into the night, no more spontaneous trips or romantic gestures. We were living together, but it felt like we were drifting apart. I tried to bridge the gap between us, to bring back the spark that had once defined our relationship. I planned weekend getaways, cooked her favorite meals, and even surprised her with gifts, little tokens of affection that I hoped would remind her of the love we shared. But no matter what I did, it never seemed to be enough. Caroline would smile and thank me, but her eyes remained distant, her mind somewhere else entirely. It wasn't just the emotional distance that bothered me. There were physical signs, too. She became more protective of her phone, always keeping it within arm's reach. If I happened to glance at her screen while she was texting, she'd quickly turn it away, as if guarding some secret. I told myself that I was overreacting, that it was just her being private, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. One night, as we lay in bed, I noticed her phone light up with a message. She quickly grabbed it, her fingers flying over the screen as she typed out a response. I didn't say anything, but I couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. Who was she talking to so late at night? Why did she seem so eager to hide it from me? "Who's texting you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Just a client," she replied without looking up, her voice flat and uninterested. "A client? At this hour?" She sighed, finally meeting my gaze. "Yes, a client. I told you, I'm working on a big project. They have questions sometimes." Her explanation made sense, but it didn't make me feel any better. I wanted to believe her, but the unease gnawed at me, refusing to be silenced. There were other things too, small but telling. She began going out more often, claiming she needed time to unwind after work. When I offered to join her, she'd brush me off, insisting that she needed some space, some time to herself. I didn't want to crowd her, so I backed off, but it left me feeling more isolated than ever. The intimacy between us had dwindled as well. We used to be so close, so in tune with each other's needs, but now it felt like we were just going through the motions. There were nights when she would turn away from me in bed, saying she was too tired or not in the mood, and when we did make love, it felt mechanical, devoid of the passion that had once defined our relationship. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was pulling away from me, and I had no idea how to stop it. One particularly cold evening, I came home from work to find the house dark and empty. Caroline had left a note on the kitchen counter saying she was out with friends and not to wait up. I poured myself a drink and sank into the couch, staring at the note for what felt like hours. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was just being paranoid, but the loneliness was overwhelming. That night, I decided to confront her. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. I needed to know what was going on, even if it meant hearing something I didn't want to hear. When she finally came home, it was well past midnight. She walked in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, and gave me a tired smile. "You're still up?" she asked, hanging her coat on the rack. "Yeah, I wanted to talk to you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, what's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "Caroline, I feel like something's been off between us lately. You're always busy, always distracted. I want to know if everything's okay, with us." Her expression softened, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes, but then it was gone, replaced by that same distant look I'd grown so accustomed to. "I'm sorry, I know I've been distant," she said, taking a seat beside me on the couch. "Work has just been really stressful lately. I didn't mean to make you feel like I was pulling away." Her words were reassuring, but they didn't match her actions. I wanted to believe her, but there was still that nagging doubt, that feeling that she wasn't telling me the whole truth. "I just want us to be okay," I said, reaching for her hand. "We are okay," she replied, squeezing my hand gently. "We're just going through a rough patch, that's all. It'll get better, I promise." But as she leaned in to kiss me, I couldn't shake the feeling that her promises were as hollow as the look in her eyes. We went to bed that night, lying side by side, but it felt like we were worlds apart. In the days that followed, I tried to push my doubts aside, to focus on work and let things run their course. But it was easier said than done. The more I tried to ignore the signs, the more they seemed to multiply. I found myself growing increasingly suspicious, analyzing every word, every gesture, looking for clues. I became more attentive, watching her closely, trying to decipher the truth hidden beneath her calm exterior. It was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, but I couldn't help it. I needed to know if my fears were justified, if the woman I loved was hiding something from me. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the truth began to reveal itself in the most unexpected way. It all started with a small, innocuous detail, something that, under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have even noticed. But given the state of mind I was in, it felt like a red flag waving right in front of my face. One Friday afternoon, I decided to leave work early. It was rare for me to take time off, but I felt the need to reconnect with Caroline, to remind her and myself of the bond we once shared. I had planned a quiet evening at home, just the two of us, free from distractions. Maybe we'd cook dinner together, open a bottle of wine, and talk like we used to. I thought a surprise might bring a smile to her face, might reignite that spark. I was about to leave the office when I got a text from her. "Working late again tonight. Don't wait up." Disappointment settled over me like a heavy blanket. This had become the new normal, her working late, her life seemingly orbiting around something I was no longer a part of. Still, I tried to push the negativity aside. Maybe I'd drop by her office with some takeout, surprise her, and see if we could share a late-night meal together. With that thought, I headed to her workplace. The drive was quiet, filled with the kind of anticipation that borders on anxiety. As I approached the office building, I noticed that the lights were still on, a few windows glowing against the darkening sky. It wasn't unusual. Caroline's firm often worked long hours, especially on big projects. But as I parked the car and approached the building, something caught my eye. It was Caroline standing outside, talking to a man I didn't recognize. They were close, too close for a casual conversation. He was tall, with dark hair, dressed sharply in a suit that spoke of success and confidence. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the way they were looking at each other sent a chill down my spine. There was an intimacy in their body language, something that felt wrong. Before I could react, the man leaned in, his hand brushing her arm. Caroline laughed, a soft, flirtatious sound that I hadn't heard from her in a long time. Then, without warning, he kissed her. It wasn't a chaste kiss. It was passionate, lingering, the kind of kiss that spoke of familiarity, of a relationship that was far more than just professional. My heart plummeted, a sickening mix of disbelief and rage boiling in my veins. I felt rooted to the spot, watching them like a voyeur, unable to tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding before me. After a moment, she pulled back, glancing around as if to make sure no one had seen them. Her face was flushed, her smile lingering as they exchanged a few more words before heading back into the building together. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind reeling, The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted implicitly, was cheating on me. And she didn't even have the decency to hide it from the world, or from me. I couldn't confront her right then and there. I was too angry, too hurt to think straight. Instead, I turned on my heel and walked back to my car, every step heavy with the weight of what I had just witnessed. I drove home in a daze, my thoughts spinning in a chaotic loop. How long had this been going on? Who was this man? And why had I been so blind? Once home, I poured myself a drink, hoping it would numb the pain, dull the anger. But nothing seemed to help. The image of her with him was burned into my mind, a wound that refused to heal. I knew I needed answers, and I knew the only person who could give them to me was Caroline. I didn't have to wait long. A few hours later, she came through the door, her usual serene expression in place, as if nothing had happened. She greeted me with a tired smile, setting her bag down by the door. "You're still up?" she asked, her voice casual, but to me, it was laced with deceit. "Yeah, I couldn't sleep," I replied, my tone colder than I intended. She didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't care. She walked over to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. "I was thinking we could spend some time together this weekend," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just the two of us. Maybe go out for dinner or take a drive somewhere." She paused, her back to me as she took a sip of water. "That sounds nice," she said after a moment, turning to face me. "But I have to finish up some work on Saturday. Maybe Sunday?" I nodded, even though my mind was screaming. How could she stand there lying to my face after what I'd seen? I had to bite my tongue to keep from confronting her then and there, but I needed more than just a suspicion. I needed proof, irrefutable evidence that she was betraying me. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay beside her, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of how to uncover the truth. I didn't just want to confront her with accusations, I wanted to confront her with the cold, hard facts, to see the look on her face when she realized she couldn't lie her way out of this. The next day, I took action. I hired a private investigator, a decision that felt surreal, like something out of a bad movie. But I needed to know. I needed to understand what was happening in my marriage, even if the truth was something I dreaded. It took the investigator less than a week to come back with the evidence I had feared. Photos, text messages, all of it laid out before me in stark detail. Caroline wasn't just having an affair with one man. There were others. Men from her work, clients, even strangers she'd met online. The scope of her betrayal was staggering, far beyond anything I could have imagined. I spent hours poring over the evidence, each new revelation cutting deeper than the last. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, was a stranger to me. I couldn't reconcile the person in those photos with the person I had married. By the end of it, I was numb. The anger had given way to a cold, hard resolve. Caroline had destroyed our marriage, shattered the trust between us in the most brutal way possible, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. As I sat there in the dim light of our living room, surrounded by the damning evidence of her infidelity, I began to plan. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. No. I was going to make sure she paid for what she had done in a way that she would never forget. For days, I carried the weight of Caroline's betrayal like a stone in my chest. It was there with me in every moment, a constant reminder of the woman I thought I knew, and the lies she had been living. I couldn't look at her without seeing the images burned into my mind, couldn't hear her voice without replaying the messages I had read. Yet I kept up the charade. I played the role of the loving husband, going through the motions while inside, I was a storm of anger and heartbreak. I knew I couldn't confront her directly. Caroline was smart, too smart for her own good, and I needed to catch her off guard. If I let my emotions get the better of me, if I lashed out without a plan, She might find a way to wriggle out of it, to turn the tables and somehow make me the bad guy. No, I needed to be careful, methodical. I needed to wait for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came sooner than I expected. Caroline's parents were celebrating their 30th wedding anniversary, and they had planned a big party to mark the occasion. They were the quintessential couple, deeply in love, supportive of each other, and seemingly inseparable. They had been married for decades, and yet they still looked at each other like they were newlyweds. Watching them together always brought a bittersweet pang to my heart, especially now, when my own marriage was in shambles. The anniversary party was set to be a grand affair, with friends and family gathering to celebrate. Caroline had been heavily involved in the planning, spending hours on the phone with her mother, discussing every detail from the menu to the guest list. She seemed genuinely excited about it, throwing herself into the preparations with a fervor I hadn't seen in a while. It was as if this party was the only thing holding her together, a distraction from whatever demons she was wrestling with. As the date of the party approached, I could see the tension in her build. She was more on edge than usual, snapping at me over small things, but always apologizing afterward, blaming it on the stress of planning such a large event. I played along, feigning concern and understanding, all the while keeping my true feelings hidden beneath a mask of calm. Then, a few days before the party, Caroline told me about the surprise she had planned for her parents. "I've put together a video," she said, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "It's a montage of pictures and videos from their life together, from when they first met until now. I even got some clips from their old friends, and it turned out beautifully. I can't wait to show it to them. It's going to be the highlight of the evening." She was genuinely excited, the pride evident in her voice as she talked about the video. It was a side of her I hadn't seen in a long time, and for a brief moment I felt a pang of guilt for what I was planning. But then I remembered the photos, the messages, the betrayal that she had so carefully hidden from me. The guilt faded, replaced by the cold resolve that had been my constant companion these last few days. The night of the party arrived, and everything seemed perfect. Caroline looked stunning in a sleek black dress that hugged her figure in all the right places. She was the picture of grace and elegance, the perfect hostess, mingling with the guests, smiling, laughing, and playing the role of the devoted daughter and wife. If I hadn't known the truth, I would have been fooled too. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere was filled with joy and celebration. Caroline's parents were the center of attention, beaming with happiness as they were surrounded by loved ones. I could see how much they meant to her, and for a moment I wondered if this was why she had strayed. Was she trying to fill some void, some emptiness that I couldn't see? But that thought was quickly pushed aside. Whatever her reasons, they didn't justify what she had done. The highlight of the evening was fast approaching, and I could feel the tension in the air as Caroline gathered everyone's attention. She stood up, her glass in hand, and smiled warmly at her parents. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate this incredible milestone in my parents' lives," she began, her voice steady and confident. "You've shown us all what true love and commitment look like, and I am so grateful to have you both as role models. To honor you, I've prepared something special. A video that captures the essence of your love story. I hope it brings back many wonderful memories." There were murmurs of appreciation from the crowd, and Caroline's parents looked at her with pride and affection. She was their golden child, the one who could do no wrong in their eyes. Caroline walked over to the projector, ready to play the video that she had so painstakingly created. As she pressed the button to start, she gave me a quick smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. I watched her closely, my heart pounding in my chest, knowing that everything was about to change. The lights dimmed, and the video began to play. At first, it was exactly what everyone expected. Pictures of Caroline's parents in their younger years, their wedding, the birth of their children. The audience was captivated, and I could see tears glistening in the eyes of Caroline's mother. But then, suddenly, the screen went black. There was a brief moment of confusion, and Caroline frowned, looking at the projector as if something had gone wrong. And then, the video resumed. Only it wasn't the video Caroline had intended to show. The scene that appeared on the screen was explicit, unmistakable, and utterly damning. Caroline, naked and writhing, in the throes of passion with not one, but 5 different men, one after another, all captured in stark, undeniable detail. The gasps from the crowd were almost drowned out by the sound of Caroline's father's glass shattering on the floor. It was chaos. Caroline's face went from confusion to horror in an instant, her skin turning ashen as she realized what was happening. Her mother screamed, clutching at her chest, while her father staggered back, his hand over his heart, his face contorted in pain. And then, as if in slow motion, he collapsed. The room erupted into panic, people rushing to his side, trying to revive him, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and all the while the video continued to play, the images a brutal, unrelenting reminder of Caroline's betrayal. In the midst of the chaos, I stood back, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I hadn't planned for it to go this far, hadn't expected her father to collapse, to possibly die from the shock, but now there was no stopping it. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. As the paramedics arrived and people began to scream for someone to stop the video, I locked eyes with Caroline. The look on her face, shock, terror, disbelief, was something I would never forget. She knew in that moment that it was over, that her life, as she knew it, had been shattered beyond repair. And I, the man she had betrayed, was the one who had pulled the trigger. But this was only the beginning. The fallout from that night was going to be more brutal, more devastating than either of us could have ever imagined. And as I watched the woman I had once loved break down in front of me, I knew there was no going back. This was our reality now, one filled with the wreckage of what we once had, and the dark, twisted path that lay ahead. The night of the anniversary party marked the beginning of the end for Caroline and me. In the days that followed, the fallout from that night rippled through our lives, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. The shock of the video, the public humiliation, the heart attack that nearly claimed her father's life. It was all anyone could talk about. Caroline's father survived, but just barely. He was rushed to the hospital and stabilized, but the doctors said he'd have to take it easy from now on, that any additional stress could be fatal. Her mother, a fragile woman to begin with, seemed to age a decade overnight. The betrayal had cut deep, and the knowledge that it had been their daughter, their perfect, golden daughter, who had caused all this, was almost too much for them to bear. For Caroline, the aftermath was nothing short of catastrophic. In the span of one night, she had gone from being the pride of her family and a respected professional to the subject of gossip, ridicule, and scorn. Her phone rang constantly. Sometimes it was friends, desperate to understand what had happened. Other times, it was reporters looking for a scoop. And then there were the messages from those who had seen the video online, people who had no connection to her but delighted in her downfall. They sent her vile messages, calling her every name in the book, threatening her, mocking her. The anonymity of the internet gave them the courage to say things they would never dare say to someone's face. Caroline became a prisoner in her own home, afraid to show her face in public. The shame was too much for her to bear. She barely ate, barely slept, and when she did, it was only with the help of sleeping pills. She spent most of her days in bed, the blinds drawn tight, as if shutting out the world could somehow make everything go away. But there was no escaping it. The video was out there, spreading like wildfire, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I, on the other hand, felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction, of course, a dark, twisted sense of justice that came from seeing her brought low after everything she had done. But there was also guilt. Guilt that gnawed at the edges of my mind, reminding me that I had taken things too far. I hadn't meant for her father to get hurt, hadn't intended for the video to go public, but the genie was out of the bottle, and there was no putting it back. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to leave her. Not yet. Part of me wanted to see how far she would fall, to watch as she tried to claw her way out of the pit she had dug for herself. But another part of me, perhaps the part that still remembered the woman I had once loved, felt an obligation to stay, if only to witness the consequences of my actions. The days turned into weeks, and slowly the world began to move on. The scandal was still fresh, but new gossip took its place, and the public's attention shifted elsewhere. For Caroline, though, the wounds were still raw. She avoided her parents, too ashamed to face them after what had happened. When they finally did speak, it was over the phone, and the conversation was short and strained. Her father's voice was weak, his words tinged with disappointment and hurt. "I don't know what to say to you, Caroline," he had said, his voice trembling. "You've broken our hearts. Your mother and we don't know how to move forward from this." She cried after that call, sobbing into her pillow as if it could muffle the sound of her anguish. I stood outside the bedroom door, listening, my heart a cold, heavy weight in my chest. This wasn't the victory I had imagined. It was hollow, bitter, and it left a sour taste in my mouth. Work was another story altogether. Caroline's career, once so promising, was now in tatters. Clients began to pull their contracts, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Her boss, who had always spoken so highly of her, had no choice but to let her go. The company couldn't afford the bad publicity, and Caroline became collateral damage. I continued to go to work, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. My colleagues treated me with a strange mix of pity and curiosity. They knew what had happened, everyone did, but no one dared to bring it up. Instead, they offered awkward smiles and overly polite greetings, as if afraid that one wrong word might set me off. I avoided socializing, preferring to keep my head down and get through the day as quickly as possible. The office, once a place where I felt in control, now felt like a minefield, every conversation a potential trigger for memories I didn't want to revisit. I couldn't concentrate, my mind constantly drifting back to the events of that night, replaying them over and over again, trying to make sense of the chaos I had unleashed. At home, Caroline and I barely spoke. The silence between us was heavy, oppressive, filled with all the things we didn't dare say. She avoided me, staying in the bedroom most of the time, while I took to sleeping on the couch. It was as if we were both waiting for something, though neither of us knew what it was. One evening, after weeks of this unbearable limbo, Caroline finally emerged from the bedroom. She looked gaunt, her cheeks hollow, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She stood in the doorway, staring at me for a long moment before finally speaking. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm leaving." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. I didn't ask where she was going or what she planned to do. I just nodded, the numbness inside me spreading until I felt nothing at all. "Do whatever you need to do," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. "It's over." She didn't argue, didn't try to explain or justify herself. There was no point. The damage was done, and there was no fixing it. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room. I heard her moving around the house, packing a bag, and then a few minutes later the front door closed behind her. She was gone. For a long time I sat there, staring at the door, waiting for some feeling to break through the numbness. But there was nothing. No relief, no sadness, no anger. Just an empty, hollow space where my heart used to be. In the weeks that followed, I heard from her only once. She called to tell me that she was staying with a friend, that she was filing for divorce. Her voice was distant, detached, as if she had finally accepted the reality of our situation. I agreed to everything, not wanting to drag out the process any longer than necessary. The divorce was quick, almost clinical. There were no children, no shared assets to fight over, so it was just a matter of signing the papers and walking away. It was done within a few months, and I was officially a free man. But freedom didn't feel like I had imagined it would. It felt empty, like the world had lost its color, and I was drifting through it without purpose. The revenge I had sought, the justice I thought I wanted, had left me with nothing but regret. As I sat alone in the house that had once been filled with so much promise, I couldn't help but wonder where it had all gone wrong. How had we ended up here? Two people who had once loved each other, now nothing more than strangers with a shared history. But there were no answers, only the cold, hard truth that our lives had been irreparably damaged, and there was no going back. Caroline's departure left a void in my life, one that I tried to fill with routine, with work, with anything that would keep me from thinking too deeply about what had happened. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, the memories were always there, lurking in the corners of my mind, ready to spring out at the most unexpected moments. The house felt different without her. It was too quiet, too still, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that would never come. I had thought that her leaving would bring me some measure of peace, that without her constant presence, I could finally begin to heal. But instead, it only made the silence louder, the emptiness more profound. I tried to keep busy, throwing myself into my work with a fervor that bordered on obsession. I stayed late at the office, took on extra projects, anything to keep from going home to that empty house. My colleagues noticed the change, of course, but no one said anything. They had stopped asking questions a long time ago, understanding that I wasn't ready to talk about it, that I might never be. But no matter how many hours I spent at work, the nights were the worst. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything over and over in my mind. The look on Caroline's face when she realized what I had done, the sound of her father's body hitting the floor, the way the guests had recoiled in horror as the video played on. These were the images that haunted me, that kept sleep at bay, no matter how exhausted I was. And then there were the nightmares. They came almost every night, vivid and relentless, dragging me back to that party, forcing me to relive it all over again. In the dreams, I was always too late to stop the video, too late to save her father, too late to prevent the collapse of everything I had once held dear. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sheets would be tangled around me, soaked with sweat, and I would lie there in the dark, trying to convince myself that it was just a dream, that it was over. But it wasn't over. Not really. The aftermath of what I had done was still unfolding, like ripples spreading out from a stone thrown into a pond. And those ripples were reaching places I hadn't anticipated, dragging me into a whirlpool of regret that I couldn't escape. One day, not long after the divorce was finalized, I received a call from Caroline's mother. It was the first time I had heard from her since the night of the party, and her voice was barely recognizable, so strained and brittle that I had to strain to understand her words. "James," she began, her voice trembling. I don't know how to say this, but I thought you should know. Caroline, she tried to take her own life." The words hit me like a sledgehammer, knocking the breath out of me. I gripped the edge of my desk, the world, tilting around me as I tried to process what she had just said. "She's in the hospital," her mother continued, her voice breaking. "They say she's stable, but, James, she's not the same. She's broken, and I don't know if she'll ever be whole again." I wanted to respond, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. All I could think about was Caroline, lying in a hospital bed, alone and shattered, the weight of everything that had happened crushing her spirit until she saw no other way out. Her mother was still talking, but I barely heard her. My mind was reeling, a whirlwind of guilt and shame and a sickening realization that I had played a part in pushing Caroline to this point. I had wanted revenge, yes, but I hadn't wanted this. I hadn't wanted her to lose everything, to lose herself in the process. "I just thought you should know," her mother said finally, her voice thick with unshed tears. Maybe if you could talk to her. I don't know, James, I don't know what to do." "I'm sorry," I managed to choke out, my voice hoarse. I'm so sorry." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then a quiet click as the call ended. I stared at the phone, my hands trembling, my stomach churning with a nauseating mix of emotions. I didn't know what to do either. I didn't know how to fix this, how to make it right. For the first time since everything had started, I felt truly lost. The revenge that had once seemed so justified now felt like a hollow victory, a Pyrrhic triumph that had cost more than I was willing to pay. I had wanted to hurt Caroline, to make her feel the pain she had caused me, but in doing so, I had destroyed not just her life, but mine as well. That night the nightmares were worse than ever. I saw Caroline's face, pale and lifeless, her eyes vacant, her body crumpled on the floor. I tried to reach her, to pull her back, but she slipped through my fingers, disappearing into the darkness. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, the echo of her name on my lips. The days that followed were a blur. I went through the motions, barely aware of what I was doing, my mind consumed by the thought of Caroline in that hospital bed. I wanted to see her, to tell her that I was sorry, that I had never meant for any of this to happen, but I couldn't bring myself to go. What could I possibly say that would make a difference? What could I do that would undo the damage that had been done? In the end, I did nothing. I stayed away, too cowardly to face the consequences of my actions, too ashamed to seek forgiveness. I told myself that it was better this way, that my presence would only make things worse. But deep down, I knew that I was just running away, trying to avoid the truth that I couldn't bear to confront. Caroline's mother called again a few weeks later to let me know that Caroline had been discharged from the hospital. She was staying with her parents, under their watchful eye, but she wasn't the same. She was withdrawn, barely speaking, as if the light inside her had been extinguished. The doctors had recommended therapy, but whether she would go was another matter entirely. After that, the calls stopped. I heard nothing more about Caroline, nothing more about how she was doing, and I didn't ask. I buried myself in work, trying to move on, trying to forget. But the guilt was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to pull me under whenever I let my guard down. And then, one day, the silence was broken. It was a letter, delivered to my office, the envelope plain and unassuming. I didn't recognize the handwriting, but as soon as I opened it, I knew who it was from. The words inside were simple, stark, written in a hand that was shaky, but determined. "James, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me. I don't know if I deserve it, but I need you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to find a way to live with what I've done, with the choices I've made. I'm trying to rebuild my life, piece by piece, even though it feels impossible. I don't blame you for what happened. I brought this on myself. But I hope, one day, that we can both find peace, that we can both move on from this and find some kind of happiness again. Take care of yourself." Caroline. I read the letter over and over, the words blurring together as tears filled my eyes. There was no anger in her letter, no accusations, no blame, just a quiet resignation, a fragile hope that maybe, somehow, we could both find a way forward. But as I sat there, the letter trembling in my hands, I realized that moving on wasn't going to be as simple as just wanting it. The scars ran too deep, the wounds too fresh. And while Caroline might be trying to rebuild her life, I was still trapped in the wreckage of what we had once been. I folded the letter carefully, tucking it away in my desk drawer. I didn't know what the future held, or if I would ever truly be able to forgive her, or myself. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a while. Hope. It wasn't much, and it wasn't enough to erase the past. But it was a start. A small, tentative step toward healing, toward finding a way out of the darkness. And as I sat there, alone in my office, I clung to that hope, holding it close like a lifeline, praying that it would be enough to pull me back from the edge. After receiving Caroline's letter, I realized that healing, for both of us, was going to be a long and painful journey. The hope that flickered in those words gave me the strength to face the reality of what I had done, to confront the demons that had been haunting me since that fateful night. I decided to seek therapy, something I had never considered before. Admitting that I needed help was difficult, but I knew I couldn't move forward without it. The guilt, the regret, and the anger were eating me alive, and if I didn't find a way to deal with it, I would be stuck in that dark place forever. My therapist, Dr. Michaels, was a calm and patient man who listened more than he spoke. In our first few sessions, I barely said a word, unsure of how to articulate the mess of emotions inside me. But gradually, I began to open up, to talk about the pain of Caroline's betrayal, the overwhelming rage that had driven me to expose her in such a brutal way, and the crushing guilt that followed when I realized the full extent of the damage I had caused. Dr. Michaels didn't judge me. He guided me through my emotions, helping me to understand that while my actions were wrong, they were a response to deep wounds that needed healing. He helped me see that forgiveness, both for Caroline and for myself, wasn't something that would come easily or quickly, but that it was a process, one that required time, patience, and a willingness to let go of the past. I spent months in therapy, peeling back the layers of pain and resentment, slowly working through the complex emotions that had been buried for so long. It was exhausting, often leaving me drained and raw, but it was also cathartic. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was making progress, like I was moving toward something better, something healthier. Caroline and I didn't speak during this time. I needed space, and so did she. But I thought about her often, wondering how she was doing, if she was finding her own way through the darkness. The image of her lying in that hospital bed, fragile and broken, haunted me. I wanted to reach out, to tell her that I was sorry, that I never wanted things to go as far as they did. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. It wasn't until nearly a year after the divorce that I finally felt strong enough to contact her. By then, I had made significant progress in my therapy. I had learned to forgive myself, to understand that while I had made mistakes, they didn't define who I was. I had also come to terms with the fact that Caroline's betrayal, as painful as it was something I could move past. It no longer consumed me the way it once had. I called her on a rainy Sunday afternoon. The sound of her voice, soft and hesitant, sent a wave of memories crashing over me. But I kept my emotions in check, focusing on what I wanted to say. "Caroline, it's James," I began, my voice steady but gentle. "I wanted to check in on you, see how you're doing." There was a pause on the other end, and then she spoke, her voice tinged with relief. "James, I'm okay. I mean, it's been hard, but I'm doing better. Thank you for calling." We talked for a while about how we were both coping, about the steps we had taken to rebuild our lives. Caroline told me that she had started therapy too, that she was slowly finding her way back to herself. She had moved out of her parents' house and was living on her own, focusing on her recovery and trying to figure out what came next. I've had a lot of time to think, she said, her voice growing more confident, about what I did and how it hurt you. I'm so sorry, James. I wish I could take it all back, but I know that's not possible. All I can do now is try to be a better person. Hearing her say those words, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had been waiting for this, for her acknowledgement, for her apology. But more than that, I realized that I didn't need her to apologize for me to move on. I had already started to heal, and while her words were comforting, they were no longer the key to my peace of mind. I appreciate that, Caroline, I replied, meaning every word. And I'm sorry, too, for everything. I was so angry, so hurt, that I didn't stop to think about the consequences of what I did. I never wanted things to go so far. There was a long silence on the line, and then she spoke, her voice soft. We both made mistakes, James, but we can't change the past. All we can do is learn from it and try to move forward. We talked a little longer about mundane things, how she had picked up painting again, how I was thinking of moving to a new city for a fresh start. It was a tentative, cautious conversation, but it felt good, like a bridge between the pain of the past and the hope of a new beginning. When we finally said goodbye, there was a sense of closure, of something finally being put to rest. I hung up the phone and stared out at the rain-soaked street, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The chapter of my life that had been defined by betrayal and revenge was finally closing, and in its place, a new chapter was beginning, one filled with uncertainty, yes, but also with the possibility of healing and growth. After that conversation with Caroline, I decided it was time to truly move on. I left the house we had shared, selling it to a young couple who were excited to make it their home. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. The walls were soaked in too many memories, both good and bad, and I needed a clean slate. I relocated to a smaller city, one that was quieter, more peaceful. It was a place where I could start over, where no one knew me or the story that had haunted my life for the past few years. It was exactly what I needed, a place where I could breathe again, where I could begin to rediscover who I was outside of the pain and the betrayal. In my new home, I focused on building a life that was my own, one that wasn't defined by the past. I made new friends, took up new hobbies, and slowly, I started to feel like myself again. The therapy sessions continued, but they became less frequent as I grew stronger, more self-assured. The nightmares that had once plagued me began to fade, replaced by dreams of a future that was still uncertain, but no longer filled with fear. Caroline and I kept in touch, but only sporadically. There was no need for regular contact. We had both moved on, and while we wished each other well, we knew that our paths had diverged. She was still working on herself, still trying to rebuild her life in the aftermath of everything that had happened. I wished her nothing but the best, hoping that she could find the peace she was searching for. Part 9. A New Beginning. One day, as I was sitting in a coffee shop, I met someone new. Her name was Emily, and she had a warm smile and a kind heart. We struck up a conversation, and before I knew it, we were spending more and more time together. There was something easy about being with her, something that felt natural and unforced. She knew nothing of my past, nothing of the pain I had endured, and I found comfort in that. It was a fresh start, a new beginning with someone who saw me for who I was now, not who I had been. As our relationship grew, I told her about Caroline, about the betrayal and the fallout. I wanted her to know the truth, to understand where I had come from. But I didn't dwell on it. The past was just that, the past. Emily listened, her eyes filled with understanding, and when I was done, she took my hand and smiled. That was then, she said simply. This is now. Her words were like a balm to my soul, a reminder that I had the power to choose how my story would continue. And so, I chose to embrace the present, to focus on the new life I was building with Emily, one that was filled with hope, love, and the promise of something better.